She texted me on a Wednesday afternoon in October, 3 months after Nadia and I had stopped being anything to each other. The message said, "Hey, it's Jess. I know this is probably strange. Would you be up for coffee sometime? There's something I'm supposed to tell you." I read it twice. I set my phone face down on my desk. I picked it up and read it again. The phrasing did not get less strange the third time. Jess Calloway had been Nadia's best friend since university. She was the one who had been at every dinner, every birthday, every low-key Sunday gathering, where I had spent 2 years slowly understanding that Nadia and I wanted different versions of the same life. She had been at the last one, too. The quiet, polite unraveling that Nadia and I had agreed to call a mutual decision, which is the word two people use when they both know one of them decided first. Jess had texted me 2 days later. "Just hope you're doing okay." I had replied, "Yeah, thanks, you too." And that had been it. 3 months of nothing. Until Wednesday. Until "There's something I'm supposed to tell you." I replied, "Sure." "Saturday?" She said, "Saturday works." She sent a coffee shop name near her side of the city. She said, "Thank you for not making this weird." I said I haven't done anything yet. She replied with a single laughing emoji and nothing else, which I found deeply insufficient. My name is Owen Marsh. I am 36 years old. I work in architectural drafting, which means I spend my days making other people's ideas structurally possible and my own ideas structurally theoretical. I live alone in a flat that has good light and bad shelving, and a kitchen I keep meaning to renovate. I am, by most observable measures, fine. I run. I cook reasonably well. I have friends who check in with the appropriate frequency. I had been, in the months since Nadia, the specific kind of fine that requires a small but constant maintenance effort, the way an old bicycle stays rideable as long as you don't look too closely at the tires. Nadia Reyes and I had been together for 2 years and 4 months. She was 33. She was a secondary school art teacher who came home with paint on her hands most days and who had strong opinions about natural light and weak opinions about punctuality, which had occasionally been a source of creative tension. She had dark hair she wore in a knot she never fully finished tying. She had a laugh that started small and then decided to commit. We had been good together in all the ways that matter and incompatible in the one way that turns out to matter more. She wanted to stay in this city, near her family, building something rooted, and I had been offered a 2-year contract in Lisbon that I had said yes to without quite understanding that saying yes to it meant saying something about us. When I realized, I offered to decline it. She told me not to. We both said the right things. Neither of us fully recovered from the conversation. I had not taken the contract. That was the part I had not told anyone. I met Jess on Saturday at 11 in the morning. The coffee shop was warm and slightly too loud, and she was already there when I arrived, with a flat white and the expression of someone who has rehearsed something and is not sure the rehearsal was enough. She said, "Thanks for coming." I said, "You made it sound like I shouldn't say no." She said, "I wasn't sure you would." I sat down. I ordered something. She wrapped both hands around her cup and looked at the table for a moment in the way people do when they have been carrying something for a while and are about to put it down in front of someone else. She said, "Nadia doesn't know I'm doing this. I want to be clear about that up front." I said, "Okay." She said, "She asked me to tell you something about a month ago when she was being honest in the way she only gets around 2 in the morning. She said, 'Tell Owen this if you ever see him.' And then she said, 'Never mind, don't.' And then 3 weeks later she said it again, and then said, 'Never mind' again." I said, "That sounds exhausting." Jess said it has been a little. She looked up. She said, "She cried after you left that last time. Not in front of you. She waited until you were gone. I was there. She didn't let me say anything about it. She just cried for a while, and then she made tea and talked about something else entirely, and she's been talking about something else entirely ever since." I did not say anything. The coffee shop was too loud. Someone at the next table was laughing about something that had nothing to do with any of this. Jess said, "She told me to tell you that she didn't actually want you to decline the contract. But she also told me to tell you that when you offered to, she said no because she was afraid that you'd resent her for it someday. Not because she didn't want you to." I set my cup down. Jess said, "I'm not sure that's useful information at this point. But she asked me to tell you. And then she kept asking me not to, and I've been in the middle of that for a month, and I figured, I don't know. I figured it was better out than in." I said, "Did she say anything else?" Jess was quiet for a moment. She said she keeps your number under your name with no last name. That she deleted the last name about 6 months before you broke up and she never put it back. And when she noticed she hadn't changed it back, she decided that meant something, and then tried to decide what. Something in my chest shifted. Not dramatically, just enough. I said, "Jess." She said, "I know." I said, "Did she ask you to ask me anything?" She said no. She specifically said not to ask you anything. She said she just wanted you to know. She said knowing you knew would be enough. I said, "That doesn't sound like enough." Jess looked at me for a long moment. She said, "No, it doesn't, does it?" She picked up her cup. She looked out the window. A bus went past in the October light, which did the thing autumn does where everything looks like it has been lit from just slightly the wrong direction. She said, "I'm going to tell her I saw you. She'll know something happened. She's not going to ask me what." I said, "Do you think she'd want to know that I didn't take the contract?" Jess went still. She said, "You didn't take the contract." I said I turned it down in May. I've been here. I kept meaning to find a way to say it that didn't sound like it was pressure or a statement or anything that required her to respond. So I didn't say it. Jess set her cup down with the careful precision of someone who is choosing not to react at full volume. She said, "Owen." She said it in the specific way that is not a question. I said, "I know." She said, "She lives 12 minutes from here." I said, "I know where she lives." She said, "I'm going to give you her number, even though you have it, because I think she may have changed it and not told you, and I think she would want you to have it." I said, "Did she change it?" Jess said no. "But I wanted you to understand the gesture." I laughed in spite of myself. She smiled for the first time all morning, and it was the kind of smile that belongs to someone who has been quietly hoping the conversation would arrive where it just arrived. She said, "I'm not supposed to be doing any of this." I said, "I'm glad you did." She said, she's going to be annoyed at me for about 4 minutes and then she's going to forgive me. I have run the numbers. I left the coffee shop at 12:47. I stood on the pavement in the October cold with my phone in my hand and Nadia's number on the screen. Unchanged, still just Nadia, no last name, the way I had kept it, without quite acknowledging that I had kept it that way. I called her. It rang 4 times. I was already composing a version of this as a voicemail when she picked up. She said, "Owen." I said, "Hi." She said, "Jess called me." I said, "Already?" She said, 2 minutes after you left. Apparently, she said she broke several of her own promises, and she was sorry, but also not sorry. She said I should probably talk to you. I said, she was supposed to let me do this at my own pace. She said, "You were going to call me today regardless. Don't pretend otherwise." I said, "I was. That's true." There was a pause that lasted long enough to mean something. Then she said, quieter, "You didn't take the contract." I said, "No." She said, "When were you going to tell me?" I said, "I was trying to find the right version of it. The one that didn't make you feel like it was your fault or your responsibility." She said, "It was my fault. I told you not to." I said, "You told me not to because you were trying to protect me from something that hadn't happened yet." She was quiet. I heard her exhale slowly, the way she exhaled when she was deciding how honest to be, which always preceded her being honest. She said, "I changed my contact name for you. In my phone, I had you as Owen Marsh for 3 years, and then one day, I looked and I had taken the last name off and I didn't know when I had done it." I said, "Jess told me." She said, "Of course she did." I said, "When did you notice?" She said, "About a year ago. Maybe 13 months. I thought about changing it back. I decided if I left it, it meant I was still. I didn't finish the sentence. In my own head, I mean. I wasn't ready to finish the sentence. I said, "Are you ready now?" She was quiet for long enough that I counted the seconds without meaning to. Then she said, "I think I have been ready for longer than I've been willing to say." I said, "I live 17 minutes from you. I've been here since May. I should have called months ago. I'm sorry I made you carry this for a year." She said, "I should have said yes. When you offered to stay, I should have said yes." I said, "You weren't wrong to do what you did." She said, "Neither were you. We were both trying to protect each other from things that hadn't happened yet. We were very considerate. It was extremely inconvenient." I said, "Can I come over?" She said, "I was going to ask you that." I said, "I know. I didn't want to wait." She said, "I have paint on my hands. I was working on something this morning." I said, "That is not the deterrent you think it is." She laughed. It started small and then committed, the way it always had. The way I had been replaying in the specific low frequency of something you are not willing to call missing, because missing implies you have accepted the loss. I had not accepted the loss. I had just run out of ways to say so. She said, 17 minutes? I said, 15 if I walk fast. She said, "Don't walk fast. I need to clean up a little." I said, "You really don't." She said, "Owen." I said, 14 minutes. She said, "I'll put the kettle on," and hung up. I walked the 17 minutes at a completely normal pace, which is to say I walked them in 14 and a half and stood outside her building for 90 seconds pretending to check my phone. She buzzed me up without saying anything. The stairwell smelled like the building always had, old stone and someone's cooking from the second floor. Her door was open when I reached it. She was standing in the kitchen doorway with paint on her left hand and her hair half up in the knot she never fully finished, and the expression she wore when she was deciding whether to say the careful version or the true one. She said hi. I said hi. She said, "I'm annoyed at Jess." I said, "You're not." She said, "No, I'm not. But I'm going to tell her I am for at least 4 minutes." I said, "She said you would." She looked at me across the hallway. She said, "You stayed." I said, "I stayed." She said, "That's the part I would have wanted to know." I said, "I know. I'm sorry it took this long." She crossed the hallway. She put her non-painted hand flat against my chest in the way that is not a push and not an embrace, and is its own particular vocabulary. She said, "I kept your name the way I kept it, because changing it back felt like closing something I wasn't ready to close. And I thought about calling you, and then I thought about what I'd say, and everything I came up with felt too large or not large enough. And I was trying to decide between those options when Jess texted me a minute ago and said she'd gone rogue. I said, "Are you glad she did?" She said, "Yes." She paused. She said, "Don't tell her I said that for at least a week." I said, "I can manage that." She looked up at me. She said, "I don't want to do the careful version again of any of this. I want to just say the thing." I said, "Then say it." She said, "I didn't want you to go. I wanted you to choose to stay. And I was afraid that if I asked you to, you'd say yes for the wrong reasons. And then eventually you'd look at your life and wonder. I didn't want to be the reason you wondered, so I told you not to." I said, "And if I'd gone?" She said, "I would have been fine, and I would have been quietly devastated. Both of those things." I said, "I know the feeling." She said, "You stayed and didn't tell me." I said, "I was quietly devastated in a different direction." She laughed once, soft, and then she stepped forward, and I put my arms around her, and she tucked her chin against my shoulder with the ease of something returning to where it belonged rather than arriving somewhere new. We stood in the hallway of her flat for a long time. The kettle finished boiling. Neither of us moved. Eventually she said, against my shoulder, "The tea's going to be overdrawn." I said, "That's not the phrase." She said, "It should be." I said, "It really shouldn't." She pulled back just enough to look at me. She said, "Stay for the afternoon." I said, "I'll stay for longer than that if you'll have me." She looked at me in the way she looked at things she had decided were true. She said, "I've had you under just your first name for 13 months. I think that answers the question. About 6 months later, Jess came for dinner. She arrived with wine and the specific satisfaction of someone who has watched a slow-motion situation finally resolve. She toasted herself at one point, which Nadia pretended to object to for about 30 seconds before joining in. Jess said, "I want it on the record that I acted with tremendous personal courage." Nadia said, "You went rogue. You broke 3 separate agreements." Jess said, "Courage takes many forms." I said, "She's not wrong." Nadia looked at me. She said, "Do not encourage her." She was smiling when she said it, the kind that started small and committed. A year after that, when people asked us how we found our way back, we had 2 versions of the story. Nadia said a mutual friend helped. I said a mutual friend staged an intervention with plausible deniability. Nadia said we both had the same idea at the same time and just needed someone to hand us the phone. Both versions are true. The real version is that we had been keeping each other under just our first names for longer than we had admitted. And eventually, someone noticed what that meant before we were ready to say it ourselves. Nothing about us had changed. Really, she still came home with paint on her hands. I still thought about renovating the kitchen, and didn't. She still made tea when the kettle had already boiled too long. I still walked faster than I needed to, and then waited outside like I had all the time in the world. The only difference was that now we didn't have to pretend that none of it was anything. It probably always had been her. I had just needed a Wednesday afternoon text and a very brave, very unreliable best friend to make me admit what I had been keeping under my first name all along. What would you have done if someone told you your ex had been holding something back that changed everything? And have you ever been too careful with someone you loved? Tried so hard to protect them that you forgot to tell them the truth? Tell me your story in the comments. If you like this one, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.